Welcome back, AP. All right, man, oh man, it is Wednesday, right? Which means second flip being posted, your LEQ is being sent out, and quick announcement, you're going to have a quiz the day you get back from break. Yup, that's right, a short 10-question multiple choice quiz based on the stuff from this flip particularly, okay? So heavy on this flip. And I know some of y'all right now are probably stressed out about that, and also you got to write your LEQ and stuff, and some of y'all probably feel a little bit like this.
Huh? No? Oh, don't cry, are you?
But you know what? That's okay, all right? So, remember, it's an AP class. It's meant to be challenging. We have to move. We got to stay on pace. We got to make sure that we're giving you the best quality product that we can, and that includes getting assessed, moving forward, etc., etc. And I have also started grading your tests, and those should be graded by Friday, and then also they'll be posted by Friday. And then on top of all that, your DBQs will be graded by the Monday you get back, okay? So, big news going forward, but this flip, very important, okay? So go ahead and buckle up, strap in for about 35 minutes of some really quality, awesome content. Some of you are like, all right, but it's going to be fine, okay? It's going to be fine. So where we left off in the last flip, we were talking about the ascendancy of Great Britain, right? Now, big thing that you should be focusing on when you're writing your flip is the back half of the last flip and this flip in totality on the ascendancy of Britain, all right? So, because it's very important. Because you might say, hypothetically, that they ascended via economic domination when it comes to the agricultural revolution, the industrious revolution, the pre-industrial revolution, putting out system process of manufacturing. And then you also might say that they geopolitically dominated the entire scene of European politics by this point because of victories in wars like the War of Austrian Succession and then the 7 Years' War, right? You could say that. I think you could say that because those things led to them having international trade developments and also monopolies on shipping. All right, so, I mean, you could say that, right? Theoretically, couldn't you say that? Now, anyway, but going forward, you have to understand that all this shifting, all this dominance now of England of economic trade, but also this European shifting back and forth is brought to you not by viewers like you in the Reading Rainbow, but by trade and making as much money as you possibly can get your hands on, right? So when we're talking about economic trade, intercoastal trade, geopolitical trade debates, and also power struggles, you have to understand that when you were younger, right? When you were younger, you were always taught that European trade over the Atlantic looks something like this. Oh, Miss Robinson, or whatever my teacher's name is, that's the triangle trade, and raw materials go here, and then these go there, and then the slaves go here, and then it all starts over again. Well, look, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is not how simple this entire trade infrastructure was, right? The trade networks of the 1700s actually looked something a lot more like this, right? And what the heck? Those are not my nails. I know that. Are those my wife's nails? Nope, those are my mom's nails. She was holding this book up for me so I could take a picture. So now look. Big thing, though, about this right here, as you can see, it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just goods are going from Europe to Africa, and then African slaves are going from Africa to North America, and then North American products are going to blah, 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 blah. As you can see, it was a back and forth and all over the place, goods going anywhere, up, down, sideways, and all over, okay? So with that, you have to understand to dominate those trade networks and also those trade routes that they were not only sponsored by countries, right? So private corporations got in on the game as well. Examples being the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. But here's the big thing. Following the 7 Years' War and the wrapping up of the 7 Years' War and the War of Austrian Succession, which you could actually argue are one giant war together, because within all of those wars, you then also had the French and Indian War. You could seriously argue that only one trade company truly stayed alive, right? So this is very important for your LEQ. As of about 1800, the only truly large dominant sovereign trade organization left was the British East India Company. Because by 1769, the French East India Company went defunct, and then by 1800, January 1st, the Dutch East India Company went defunct because they were outbid and over-monopolized by the British East India Company. And how were they able to do this? How were they able to go from being the one of three major players on the intercoastal tradeways to dominating trade in totality? A lot of it has to do with these bad boys right here, okay? So, the ship of the line, all right? So, right there, the British invested in their navy, right? They became the one and only dominant naval, huge powerhouse fleet of the entire Western world, right? That right there is a British warship, the HMS Hercule, all right? So this thing right here is known as a ship of the line, right? Ship of the line as in they will line up and then use these gigantic artillery guns on their side, these cannons, to absolutely bombard, fire, and sink enemy vessels that may or may not be also trade vessels, right? So you have to understand that the ability for the British to not only trade but wage war efficiently across the oceans is the reason why they were able to create monopolies, and then also the reason why they were able to force out the other two individuals, right? Because the Anglo-Dutch wars that popped up after the Navigation Acts under Cromwell are going to lead to the downfall of the Dutch East India Company because they're going to lose half of their trade market, and then also, not to mention the fact that just winning the 7 Years' War is going to lead to the downfall of the French East India Company, right? And that means that even Dutch, the Netherlands, and the French are now going to have to trade on British vessels, right? So not completely, not solely, and it's ignorant to say that only the British now had boats in the water. That would be ridiculous. It just meant that, internationally speaking, that the British outnumbered other vessels somewhere in the neighborhood of probably anywhere from 7-1 to 10-1, right? So absolutely dominating the seas now is a very important theme. And I know, Marie Rowley, you're like, but Mr. Terry, I thought you said that war is going to help the Dutch grow in the Netherlands. It does, right? To a degree. It helps them establish themselves, right? But like we said, once they hit that Dutch Golden Age and the Anglo-Dutch War start, they kind of plateau on that Golden Age era, right? And they kind of just hit this stride where they never then truly continue to advance, okay? Because even when the Dutch Golden Age happened and when they hit their Golden Age period, were they ever as big, large, money, or wealthy, or as advanced as the French and the British? No, come on. The French and the British had a culture that was hundreds of years older than the Dutch, and the Dutch had only recently been free from the Spanish as soon as 1581. So, it's not to say that they weren't still having a great grand period. They just weren't having a period as big or as large or as luminous, if you will, as the British or the French, right? Now, how, though, is Europe or England particularly, going to continue to make money off of this entire system, right? Because a lot of y'all are probably thinking, I feel like Britain's going to end up losing money in this thing because now they have to send ships all the way over to the to the Americas, bring goods all the way back, get those goods inside of this really small cottage industry that exists, because this is pre-industrial revolution, right? Pre-industrial revolution. The Industrial Revolution technically starts around 1750, but it's not nearly as large as the second industrial revolution that occurs in the 1800s. But Europe, particularly Great Britain, is going to make a buttload of money off colonial goods, right? How, though? How do you make so much money off these goods? Well, you have to understand, they're buying raw materials from the American colonies. These raw materials include timber, gold, bullion, silver bullion, cotton, and also other cheap materials. Big one also, sugar, coffee, chocolate, teas coming from Asia. They're going to get a hold of all this stuff, and then they're going to do the most insane thing you've ever heard of. They're going to manufacture it into other goods, and then they're going to sell it back to them.
Oh, you're going low. I can do... Oh, that's hard. Wait, how did you do the thing with the clouds and the the lightning.
Look how devious and like just mischievous that little boy is, right? Yeah, you have to understand that following the French and Indian War, following the 7 Years' War, following the War of Austrian Secession, this is the size now of the British Empire in North America, right? Goods can be manufactured, or not manufactured, goods can be grown, created, and then moved from this entire new overseas empire all the way over to Britain for them to be processed in that primitive putting out system during the Industrious Revolution, and then they can take those goods and then sell them back to the people that live here, right? Because the people in the 13 colonies and the people in the Americas did not have any manufacturing centers to do anything with those raw materials, but they still needed things like wood planks to build homes out of, or cotton just to wear, clothing to wear, or coffee that had been roasted in large facilities, or like molasses that had then been converted into things like rum or like sugar, basic sugar, right? So, but just to give you a heads up also, it's not just Great Britain, okay? Now, Great Britain is the overwhelming dominant powerhouse, but to sit there and say that like France and the Netherlands never made any money ever again is just kind of foolish and stupid, right? Don't speak in terms of totality. Never, in European history, it's never total. It's never like, oh, only England. Oh, well, unless you're talking about their dominance of India, which we'll get to in a minute. But like, only France, only this, only that. It's kind of going to affect everything. This push and pull, these strings from all over, right? So, big thing though, France is going to stay, to a degree, prosperous. You have to understand when you're really looking at it, France wasn't making that much money off of all this stuff in the first place, because when we looked at the French and Indian War, they ended up losing that war because their entire territory was super underpopulated, right? 55,000 versus 1.2 million. The French had to ally with a bunch of Native American tribes just to fight that war, right? So your big thing about it is like when you would walk around these areas of the French territory, sometimes there wouldn't even be anybody living there. There would just be a sign that say, hey, France land. So, big thing though, they are going to stay somewhat prosperous and continue to make some money, particularly off a few of their bigger colonies. Haiti is going to be a big one. Haiti, also known as Saint-Domingue, is going to ship out a ton of sugar. Martinique, Guadeloupe, right? So, however, the amount of debt occurred by the French in those wars is going to help lead to revolution, right? So, now Spain is also kind of like sort of recovering, right? Like, so again, they never get to be as big as they were under Charles V and Philip II and Isabella and Ferdinand. The Castile monarchy and then the Habsburg monarchies that controlled Spain leading up to the Dutch War of Independence, or the 80 Years' War in 1581, which kind of culminates Spain's rise, right? They never get back to that point. Ever. Just go ahead and know that. They never become as big or as dominant. But their economy is beginning to recover, okay? Their silver mining is stabilizing. Their inflation rate is stabilizing. They're going to gain the Louisiana territory from the French due to this entire war, right? They actually end up taking this entire area, and the entire Louisiana territory goes to Spain, right? And some of y'all are like, but I thought France sold it to us. We'll get there. You got to know who sold it to us, right? So he is a French guy, but you got to know who he sold to us, right? And then also Spanish society, though, is going to expand. You're going to see the colonies of Spain become much more what you would consider independent colonies and independent nation states of their own, right? Spain is going to continue to use the colonies for profit. However, they're never going to be completely like Spanish ever again, right? And a lot of this has to do with the fact that their society is expanding. Wealthy-born colony classes known as Creoles are going to start popping up, and these are people that were born in the Spanish colonies that were wealthy landowners, right? And they're called Creoles. Then you had Peninsulares, who owned a lot of stuff over in the colonies, but they originally were born in Spain, and most of them still live there. You also had the conversion of the natives, so the natives were becoming a very large class that still existed in the Spanish territories, and you also had the only place that was actually allowed to do this, racial mixing occurring in the Spanish colonies, right? You had mestizos, which were natives and Spanish-speaking men that were actually like integrating together, and then also you had mulattoes, which was like Spanish white European men and like African women that were actually creating mixed racial classes, right? Now, just to give you a heads up, do not throw those words around. They're very like inappropriate to say in modern day like conversation, but when you're talking about it historically, it is very, very important to understand where these people came from. And you also have to understand, like some kids always like to ask me like, well, Mr. Terry, how come Spain allowed racial mixing whereas French and England did not? Well, you got to look at the different types of people who are showing up to settle there, right? French settlers were typically single men that went there to find furs, go back to France, sell their wares. It was a temporary installment, right? England, you typically had settlers that were whole families, right? Think Plymouth, think Jamestown, think religious movement, right? Think also economic opportunity. You had whole families that moved into the English colonies, right? So they already had units, so they had no need for racial mixing in particular. But in the Spanish colonies, you had mostly single men, right? So if you've got mostly single men, you're going to have a big issue with mostly single men trying to find companions, and that is going to sometimes end up with the fact that most of them are single men and none of them are actually women. It's going to usually end up leading to racial mixing, right? So now trade in Asia and Pacific. So we just talked about the Atlantic trade, right? We're just talking about the Atlantic trade, talking about how Britain is going to dominate that entire sphere, okay? So economically, they're economically going to dominate Atlantic trade following those wars, but geopolitically, they're going to also become very strong because of those wars, right? But the big thing about it is you also have to understand Britain is not only going to start owning Atlantic trade, they're also going to start headquartering themselves as the trade power in Asia and also coming into the Pacific, right? Britain is going to claim land in India from France after the 7 Years' War, right? So this begins, write this down, this begins to actually create and know and understand that Britain is going to start eking its way into India following the 7 Years' War, until the point where in 1858, they become what's known as the Raj, right? And they actually control all of India by 1858, right? Now, I know that's way far into the future because we're still in the mid-17s, but don't let that confuse you, okay? But just you need to know that the British are starting to take advantage of a very weak Indian empire because the Mughals are having a lot of issues fighting off these other Muslim tribes from the Pakistan area, and this is leading to a very weak India because they're all separated into these different Rajas or these different provinces controlled by Rajas and stuff like that, but we'll get to that later on. But you do need to also understand that then you're going to see some British explorers colonize places in Africa, discover the Cook Islands, and also discover Australia, right? And James Cook is a guy that explores this stuff, and he actually dies out in Hawaii. But just so you know, Britain is blowing up. It is getting ridiculously big, both in just generality, both in land acquisitions, and then everything else. Now we got to get into one of my favorite things to talk about in this entire unit, okay? And we are going to move fast, right? We still got about 20 minutes left to see if we can actually get all this stuff done. So let's see if we can get after it, all right? From the last thing, you just got to understand that Britain's making mad money by winning those wars, building their navy, and then buying colonial goods, manufacturing them, and selling them back to the colonies, right? And also selling them to people in Europe as well. But what about the people that are making that stuff? Any of y'all ever think about that? Any of y'all ever think about the little guy, right? Any of y'all ever think about, like, what are people's lives like now during the 1700s? The agricultural revolution, the industrious revolution, the putting out system, the cottage industry, the manufacturing centers of Europe, pre-industrial revolution are creating a dynamic new type of life, right? In the 1600s and before, you got to understand that your entire daily life was dedicated to farming and avoiding famine, right? So farming, avoiding famine, and trying to prevent the dispensation and or lack of food stores, right? So that was your main prerogative as a regular person in Europe, was to work as much as you possibly could to make as meager of an earning as you could. But now the agricultural revolution is coming on. And just like Emma Dewey, thank you for that picture. Jethro Tull was a band in the 80s. But my dad loves them. But the big thing, though, about whatever, okay, so you have to understand it's because of Jethro Tull, the enclosure movement, drainage systems, crop rotations. You now have a populace of Europe who are working hourly, working less while farming because it's now become easier, right? So, and they're also starting to make money, right? So you're going to see a massive change, right? And then also you've got people that are starting to find Enlightenment ideas, and you're starting to see all these other things. So this is going to be very Mr. Mathern animation heavy, okay? Because what we're looking at now is a massive change, okay? So if you see a red arrow, that means I'm talking about a significant change, okay? We're going from what it was to what it became, okay? And the things that are causing these changes are the Enlightenment, new economics, trade industries, things like that, okay? So that's just like a little key for you to use. One of the biggest things that's going to change is the regular life of individuals, right? Because the ideas of marriage and family life are going to significantly change in the 1700s, leading into a lot of political instability of the late 1700s, characterized mostly by the French Revolution, right? Now, marriage, right? Marriage was happening now in later life, right? So in the Middle Ages and leading up to the 1600s, typically you got married in your early 20s, late teens, right? In the Middle Ages, in the earliest Middle Ages, girls as young as y'all could have already been married to men that was a little bit, like quite a bit older than you, right? Now, but the fact of the matter is now that you've got new economic patterns, enclosure movements. You've got crop rotation systems. You now have men going outside of the home to try and figure out how to learn a trade and be economically prosperous. You have to understand is that villages need to limit the number of new marriages, right? They have to. They got to limit the number of new marriages due to the fact that if they don't, you're going to have an excessive amount of people living in this area, living in these enclosure movements, that's going to lead to landless laborers, more impoverished people, and more people that the village has to provide for. So they needed to limit that growth as much as they possibly could. So people started getting married much later in life, right? So the average age during the 1700s of getting married was about 25 to 27, right? The only way to marry was to prove your prosperity. And guess what? Now you were getting married for love. Now, not completely. Your parents usually met and they usually introduced you and it was like pseudo-arranged, right? But typically you were now getting married for love. You were choosing your partner rather than your parents choosing them for you, right? And what I mean by the only way to get married was to prove your prosperity. Village elders and councilmen had to approve your marriage. You had to prove that you could provide for a home, you could provide for a household, and that you could provide for children, which led to the adoption of this thing known as the nuclear family, right? And the nuclear family is a mom, a dad, and children. Now, you rarely saw the three-generation house, right? You rarely saw the grandparents, parents, and the children all living together. Typically, because by the time that children were born, it was a decent likelihood that your grandparents were no longer alive, right? So, now the only times that you usually ever saw this happen is if a widowed parent, right? If one of the partners of, if a child who had been married and they had children, and then their parents or the children's grandparents, one of them had died and they needed somewhere to go, they would maybe move in with the home. But this is like rare. It was increasingly rare, okay? But the nuclear family is really important. So you're seeing these economic patterns of now working outside the home and working more for a wage rather than working to sustain your family health-wise is now creating this concept of what you would call the nuclear family, right? So now people are getting married for love and they're they're adopting what you would call basic family patterns now. And you're also no longer having as many children as possible. You're having enough children to help you to work, to be educated and things to provide for, because now you're expected to provide for them, okay? And why are you expected to provide for them? Because now typically work was required outside the house, right? In the latter half of the 1700s, because of the adoption of these new economic patterns, because of the agricultural revolution, because of all these different items, usually and effect of the age of the agriculture and the industry, I just said that, you had to understand that men were now leaving their villages, moving sometimes to towns and cities, if they were lucky, and they would actually apprentice, right? So sometimes men had decent connections, right? If their father knew someone who was in a guild, and I know some of you are always like, I thought you said the guilds were dying. Yeah, they're dying, not dead yet. All right, so but the big thing though, you got to understand is that with this, as these guilds are beginning to die off a little bit, they're still looking for apprentices. So if you could have a good enough connection with your father, you might become an apprentice, and that's why you got married later in life, because you had to go learn how to apprentice to do a job for so often, right? By the time you were able to actually make your own money, you might be 25, 27, then you could go get married, provide for a home, have some fat babies, and feed them, right? So now, poor men, that was for middle class men, okay? For the poor men, you typically, life was still pretty hard, okay? So you typically went from one tough job after the other. You would be a small laborer or a farmhand laborer or something like that. Now, women could also apprentice if you were in the middle class. You could become a seamstress. You could work as a spinner. You could work in these burgeoning little baby, tiny little seamstress factories and garment factories if you were lucky. Typically, like, so no, now notice this bullet point and this bullet point are like middle class men and women, how they're acquiring work outside of the home. This bullet point and this bullet point are lower class men and women and how they're finding work outside of the home. Now, women typically from the lower class had one big opportunity when it came to work. Typically, they would serve in the homes of the wealthy families most often, right? Now, big thing about it, they would work as servants. They would work as, they would work as servants. They would work as, you know, like not mistresses. So now they would work in, sometimes. They would work as like maids and, hold on. All right. So typically, though, these women would become servants, maids, things like that. Really, really hard life, right? Really, 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 really terrible existence for a lot of these women. So you could say, actually, kind of interestingly enough, that the agricultural revolution and also the putting out system, the cottage industry and things like that, kind of negatively continues to affect the poorer communities of Europe due to the fact that these women did not exist very well. Typically, the women of the house, right? They're what are they called? They had a name. It's like the evil stepmother from Cinderella. But I can't remember what they're called. But the women of the house that actually employed these younger women would constantly be looking over them, would sometimes beat them and accuse them of sleeping with their husbands and stuff like that. Now, interestingly enough, if that did happen and then one of them got, like, pregnant or something like that, then that would be terrible consequences because that would usually mean a life of prostitution and actually life on the streets because they couldn't find work anywhere else because they had just had a child out of wedlock, right? Now, big thing, though, you got to understand is that we've got kids getting married later in life, right? You've got people growing and moving to cities. You've got dramatically different lifestyles occurring now, right? So this is going to lead to the adoption of these things known as community controls, right? So in the early 1700s, because we have men and women leaving the home to find work, because we have them getting married later in life, because we have all these crazy things happening, you have to understand that communities, village communities typically, are going to come together and they're going to create cooperative patterns of moral, social, and economic standards, right? So they're going to be like, we don't want a bunch of children born out of wedlock running around our village. We want community control, right? We want to prevent that from happening as much as possible, and that would be borderline the best thing to happen, right? So this is surprisingly successful early on, right? Because you're going to lead to a bunch of issues when it comes to, like, kids now getting married in life. They've now been going through bodily changes for like 10 years, right? So you have to make sure you do your best to prevent them from having children before they get married, right? Because if you have children before you get married, it's a very, very significant, like, terrible consequences for the woman. There's also some bad consequences for the man. Not nearly as bad as for the woman, though. And surprisingly successful early on. These community controls were things like, oh, if you got pregnant, go get married right now, right? So surprisingly successful as in the fact that like 20% of marriages already had a baby on the way. So, but that still means that 20% of people are getting married, and only 2% of children in the early 1700s were born out of wedlock, typically, right? So, big thing about it is you still got to understand that these community controls were pretty successful, and also they would be used to do things like prevent men from being mean to their wives, right? Let's say you have a marriage that was kind of forced upon two kids because they got pregnant or something like that, and it turns out the husband's a big jerk, right? One of my favorite ones is this example called the donkey rides, where in villages they would literally make a man, if they found out that he was like beating his wife or being violent to his wife, they would make him strip naked and then ride a donkey backwards, holding the tail up, basically saying he's a giant jack. You get it, right? So, like, and that was actually very prevalent during carnival time and stuff like that. They would throw everybody's dirty laundry way, way out in the middle of the, like, villages and stuff like that. So these community controls are pretty interesting, right? So you have to understand that they're like, oh, you got pregnant? Go get married right now, right? So to try and prevent things from changing and things from blowing up. But then 1750 hits, and things change significantly, right? And it led to this thing known as the illegitimacy explosion. Now, some people argue that this is because the economic patterns of the agricultural revolution, as well as the putting out system, the industrial revolution, all these kids leaving and working outside of the home, are now going to finally take hold. But the illegitimacy explosion is actually pretty crazy due to the fact that in the latter half of the 1700s, things got pretty insane, right? Men and women were now leaving home, working for wages, and now flooding into cities, right? So early on, the community controls worked, right? Because you were stamping down some of the marriages, you were making sure that they had enough to do, right? Whatever. But once these villages got full and the enclosures were completely taken up, those children who had now been forced to get married out of that 20% because their parents got like a little bit pregnant a little early on, now we're going to have to go find work somewhere else. So they're going to start flooding into the cities from 1750 and onward. So you're seeing a massive urbanization movement going on. And with that, you're going to see women going into the cities as well to find work in the homes of wealthier people, things like that. And what's going to happen is you're going to see a very large explosion of illegitimate births, right? And 2% in 1700, like we just said, 2% of children born out of wedlock. In Germany, specifically, by 1850, 1 out of every 4 children was born out of wedlock. A lot of historians like to ask why. Why did this occur? Why? Well, a lot of people believe that there were rises in prices, okay? Due to the fact that you're going to see a lot of significant rises in specific prices due to the fact that like things are now becoming more available, but like wages did not go up as prices increased, right? Wages kind of stayed stagnant, and that's going to lead to a lot of men being like, oh, well, I thought I could support a family, but I can't, so they're going to run off, right? And then also less control of young people waiting to marry, right? Because they're moving into these cities. Now, speaking of, since we have all these children running around now we got to kind of move ourselves into what do we do with these children, right? So given the fact that you got to understand is that infant mortality, still a very big problem, right? So infant mortality is still very high, okay? So if you are having a child, it's a 55% chance that child will not see the age of 10, right? 55%. Look at that. 55% of French children died before the age of 10, right? So now 30% in England, but we'll understand that here in a minute why this number is so drastically different. But your child, if you had one, could die from very common diseases. Like things like diarrhea could easily kill a child or a baby, right? Typhus, typhoid, scarlet fever are still a big deal, right? Poverty, just the idea of not being fed well enough could lead to susceptibility to these diseases and could kill the baby, right? Children were still even vulnerable going into adolescence, though. Smallpox was still a problem in the early 1700s. Certain tuberculosis is still a huge issue as well. Now, also, though, one thing you can do to try and help save your child as much as possible is nursing your child, right? So that gives them high quality proteins, immuno-boosting chemicals that exist inside the breast milk can keep the child from like dying. And actually, it's most often practiced in poorer communities, right? Poor mothers typically breastfed their own children, right? What was big, though, in the urban communities was this thing that y'all hate talking about, known as wet nursing, right? Wet nursing is when wealthy women and working women of the middle class would actually send their children to a woman in the countryside, and that woman that was breastfeeding her own children would now also breastfeed the children of other families, right? Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that you've got massive cultural issues, right? You've got urban women and working women. Working women have no time to do it, right? Because they have to try and make as much money to feed that child and also provide for their family. But urban wealthy women looked down upon it and thought it was disgusting and unpleasant and not for them and things like that. Now, really quick though, this is going to become a huge issue though, because like France is even going to sponsor a program. The government is going to sponsor a program to create like a connection between wealthy women and poorer women for wet nursing opportunities. And 55% of French children are going to die before the age of 10 because transporting the children out to these rural areas was dangerous, right? Also due to the fact that, like, I think it's like 1 in every 4, no, it's actually more, like 50% of all French children were wet nursed, right? Actually nursed by another woman that was not their mom. And so 55% of those children are going to die before the age of 10. 30% only in England because breastfeeding your own child was more common in England than it was in France, right? And so Enlightenment thinkers are going to rail against wet nursing. They're going to be like, this is dumb. Why are you doing this? This is your child. Take care of them. You are built to do this. Just do it. It'll help keep them alive. But why do I have a white line here? It's because that didn't change anything, right? It did not come about until the post-revolutionary era in the 1800s that it became common for a mother to breastfeed their own child if they were wealthy or working, right? So wet nursing still was a very, very prominent, very, very big thing. Another big reason why the French children died more often is because if you have one woman now nursing multiple children, she's not creating enough milk to provide for all these children, so it's actually leading to more disease susceptibility. So France kind of really screwed up when they created a government-sponsored wet nursing program, right? So now, interestingly enough, oh, yeah, baby, he's so sad. And then Enlightenment thinkers are going to be really upset about this, right? Then we got some other issues. Now that you have all these children running around, and you've got more stable patterns of marriage, and you've got more children being born than ever before, in the poorer communities, you're going to see a giant trend known as infanticide, which is killing your child, right? So these poor women who may have been wet nurses, who may have gotten pregnant before being married during the illegitimacy explosion, who did not have enough money to create sustenance or provide for their children, typically what would happen with them is oftentimes they would go out and they would actually kill their children, right? They would smother them in the woods or they would do something like that. So to help stop this problem, especially in France, right, they created these things known as foundling hospitals, right? Foundlings, as in they were found here. Imagine the idea of a baby in a basket left on the steps, right? So that's what was going on. So a huge, huge thing about foundling hospitals, though, is they are not that much better, right? So, if a woman in poorer communities, because of the illegitimacy explosion, because of the fact that all these children are being born out of wedlock during this period of growth and during this period of economic trend setting in Europe, you're going to see the creation of these buildings where children were just dropped off, right? And women would abandon their children rather than kill them, which is what we prefer. But unfortunately, the foundling hospitals were not any better because the best foundling hospitals in any of these countries, and foundling hospitals were established in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, England, everywhere, because the illegitimacy explosion hit everyone, right? Wet nursing was super popular in France, not so much in England. That's why we got the difference between these two statistical numbers, but it's still a big deal and a big trend. Foundling hospitals, though, if you went to the best one, you only had a 50% chance of survival because they had to bring wet nurses in to nurse those children. This could actually not be very effective sometimes. There might not be enough women to be brought in to do this. And so, but in some of the worst ones, 90% of the children never actually lived, which is really, really sad. Now, also, attitudes towards raising children are going to change significantly, okay? So before the Enlightenment, before that, there was a common phrase for disciplining your child, right? Spare the rod, spoil the child, right? Hence the idea that people before the Enlightenment thought that their children were mischievous, original, sinful little demons, right? So they're saying, if you don't whoop your child or spank them or hit them with a rod, then you are spoiling them and making them basically amoral and they're going to be villainous, terrible people, right? Now, the Enlightenment thinkers are going to be like, stop beating your children, please. And they're saying, instead, you should love them, care for them. Stop dressing them in clothes like these. Why are you putting your children in corsets and knee breeches and making them look all uncomfortable and stuff? Instead, care for them. Let them run around naked. Let them be free. Let them be like children because they are full of innocence and life. And a lot of this was actually pioneered by Rousseau himself, right? And this is going to lead the Enlightenment thinkers of this idea of education is then also going to lead to the spread of elementary education, right? Catholic institutions are going to create elementary schools, early childhood education, leading to yet again another increase in literacy rates, which we will talk about when we get to class after break. So I'll see you guys then. I hope y'all have a good one. I know this one was long and really intense, but remember, it's not going to be that bad. Study up for that quiz when we come back, and I'll see you guys soon, okay? Y'all have a good one.